Good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to welcome you to this session on sludge management in emergency disaster situations. If you're all ready to start. So our first presentation is from European Thai, who's a aspiring sanitation professional who's been working in the wash sector since 2010, a PhD candidate at the Bandung Institute of Technology in Indonesia, and has been doing a dissertation based on research on how innovation works in the emergency sanitation sector, who the stakeholders, the processes are, and barriers to effective innovation in the sanitation sector. So she'll present on that now. Each presenter, we have 3 presenters in this session of about 1 hour, so each presenter will have about 12 minutes or so, and then a couple of questions, and then we'll have time at the end for a bit of a discussion around emergency people sludge management. So, good.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Yok. I'm a PhD student looking at from Indonesia, and what my research is looking at is trying to understand how organizations and individuals design and develop new products and technologies for emergency sanitation, and trying to look at the barriers to innovation during that process, and how ways in which these barriers can be overcome. So what I'm presenting today is a part of my research. I'm going to introduce some measures that we've identified that might potentially help the design and development process. So I'll first start with why this is important. Firstly, within the humanitarian wash sector, sanitation has been identified as one of the top priorities. According to some recent research that was done. At the same time, there have been quite a number of projects looking at trying to develop some new products and new technologies to address some of these gaps, in addition to work that has been ongoing over the years by agencies and companies trying to constantly come up with new products. And what we found in our research so far is that there's strong agreement among stakeholders in the sector that there's a need to better support suppliers and product developers throughout this product development process, especially in terms of understanding what the design requirements are, helping to evaluate ideas and concepts, and helping to evaluate the prototypes when down the road. So my aim today is just to introduce some of the measures that we've identified that could potentially help support these product developers and suppliers. And we're trying to consider why these tools are required, how they could help these people, and how they contribute to the innovation process. So how we did this, we looked at what existing tools were available, either already in use or proposed. We brainstormed some ideas based on what issues we encountered within the course of our research. So I've interviewed a number of stakeholders who are involved in the innovation process, including humanitarian agencies and suppliers, designers, and so on. We looked at what tools have been used in other sectors, what tools are already available but are not being used currently by these people. And also we consulted a few people on what tools they thought would be useful. So we've come up with 35 quite specific tools, and I won't go through them one by one. And each of them fit into the 4 key stages of the product development process that we've identified earlier. But we can also categorize these tools into the type of approach and how they contribute to that product development process, And there's 6 categories here, and that's what I will try and summarize in the next few minutes. So the first one involves capturing and disseminating knowledge. So what we found is that suppliers and product developers tend to, well, firstly, they tend to mainly be from European or American countries, designing products for people who are half the world away. So most of them have never experienced situations in which they're trying to design the products for. In fact, a lot of suppliers who've supplied latrines, let's say, for years, have never actually seen their product in use. And the only time they get feedback on whether their product is working or not is if something breaks and the humanitarian agency wants a replacement or something. There's not much information that's actually available about emergency scenarios and what the design requirements are. And the information that is available tends not to be useful for the design process. So the tools under this category include trying to let people know what happens during an emergency, what the challenges, what the end users need, what the design criteria should be. But not just that, also disseminating data on the testing that has been done on new products and so on, and also on letting people know what the new products are. Because if you don't tell people that you've got a new product, no one's going to use it. The second category of tools is related to standards and procedures. So standard criteria, standardized testing, and so on. Why do you want standards? It's not about regulating. It's partly about regulating the products, but also about providing some kind of transparency and objectivity to the process. The stakeholders involved in innovation, the customers, humanitarian agencies on the one hand, and designers, product developers on the other hand, come from very different worlds, and they tend not to understand each other. So providing some kind of transparency to what the process are, saying, right, this is what we want, this is what's going to happen during testing, then provides a platform through which the two different worlds can understand each other. Providing standards also makes it easier to compare different products and technologies. For example, if you say your product is easy to clean, what does that mean? And how do I know that this latrine is easier to clean than that latrine? How do you test that? How do you prove that? What numbers or something, what can you give to show that your new product is better than the old product? Okay, the third category of tools involves formal design and evaluation tools. So what we found in our research so far is that a lot of the processes that are used to design products are quite informal. So it's things like, okay, I sketch out this idea and I think it looks good, so I decide that it's good. Or I ask a humanitarian professional, what do you think of this? And he gives his opinion, and okay, so maybe I'll do this, maybe I won't. But at the same time, there are also a lot of tools that are available from other industries that famous brands use, that they use very effectively to help them design a product that meets customers' needs, meets the end user needs. And so these are tools that could potentially help current existing designers come up with products that are effective, that are appropriate. Yeah, so tools like looking at context of use, even just having criteria, because in many cases the criteria aren't even spelled out properly. It's just the humanitarian agency saying, oh, we need something that looks like this, maybe about this tall, and then next week they say, okay, I think maybe it's something else, I don't know, I think I didn't want this. So, yeah, so having some kind of tools in place will make this process much clearer and helps effective communication as well. And the tools don't have to be very sophisticated. It can be something as simple as a checklist, just a checklist of requirements, which in the people that we interviewed, we found that it's not used very often. So something as simple as that to something more sophisticated like scoring. Right. The next tool is a system for expert review. So why do you want to look at this? Is because this is currently what already happens in the emergency sanitation sector. Typically, if a humanitarian agency asks a company to come up with a new product, then the company will come up with some ideas and then send these ideas to the humanitarian agency, who then gives their opinion on whether this idea is good or not, and how it can be improved. And this also tends to be a very informal process. It's basically just emails that come back and forth. And very often what we find is that the designers or suppliers who contact these humanitarian agencies often don't get a reply. And it's understandable because humanitarian agencies also focus on response to disasters, and if there's a major disaster happening, they tend to drop everything and respond to the disaster and not have time to respond to emails like this. This even happens when a humanitarian agency has specifically requested someone to come out with a product, and when that someone goes back to that humanitarian agency, they don't actually get a reply, and which is not very fair to the designer. And the company has put in the resources into coming up with the product. So if we can try and formalize the system, we can maybe provide more transparency to the process and also a bit more accountability to both parties to actually make good their promises. So the next category of tools involves different methods for evaluating prototypes, or maybe I should say alternative methods for evaluating prototypes. What typically happens now is once you come up with a prototype that a humanitarian agency is satisfied with, in their opinion, then they then send that prototype out for testing. And rather interestingly, one comment I got from a humanitarian practitioner, he said that this field testing is essential because we want to find out whether the product is will be acceptable to the end user. And I'm not sure what you think, but in my opinion, end user needs should be taken in much earlier in the process, and there are different ways, there are other ways of figuring out whether what the end user wants than going all the way to a prototype before you actually test it on the end user. So so it's quite difficult to also do field testing in a humanitarian situation, logistics, all sorts of things. So here we're looking at what other ways we can try and evaluate some of the design criteria. Let's say if you're looking at durability, does this really have to be tested during an emergency? Can this be done in a lab? Can treatment efficiency be tested in a non-emergency setting, and so on? And finally, we've got a number of tools to help people choose a suitable product, because it's not very easy at the moment to learn about new products. So something simple from a list of products which isn't available at the moment to something more sophisticated like decision support system. Yeah, and I'm rushing because I'm realizing about time. So our next steps will be to ask the stakeholders what they think of these tools, how useful they think it will be in the design process, and how easy they think it will be to implement, and to evaluate some of these tools in greater detail to see how they might actually work in practice, can they actually work in practice, and so on. So thank you very much. If you have any opinions on whether these tools would be useful or whether they're just rubbish, I'd be happy to hear from you. Or if you have any suggestions on extra tools as well, I'd be pleased to hear from you.
Sure, then. If you stay there a second, we'll take two questions. Two quick questions, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. I'll go straight to the
Hi, I'm Esther from Oxfam, and I was just wondering whether you considered the behavioural side of this. So, introducing new technologies often involves a attitude change or a perception and that side of things. And I appreciate that all your tools are looking at very technical elements, but you've also got to have the right change environment before you can bring about anything new and exciting.
So I think in our tools we're looking at something a bit more technical, like you said. I think having something like standardized design criteria, standardized testing can help, because then you can say, look, these are your criteria, this is what my product can do, and they meet the criteria, then better. So that's one way. Disseminating data on good case studies would help as well. Yeah, but and bad case studies.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Thanks. I'm David Burles from Hanoi University in the US. I'm just curious how some of the existing standards for response, things like the SPHERE standards, would factor into your product development.
So I think the SPHERE standards, I don't know how familiar you are with the excreta disposal standards. They're not actually very useful for design. So apart from the one toilet to 20 people, the rest are prevent odor, prevent flies, safe for women. It doesn't really say what constitutes safe. So it's very difficult to design something to that kind of very vague criteria that's currently available.
Great, thank you very much. We'll get the presenters back at the end for some more questions if we have time, but for now, thank you very much. Round of applause. Presenter. So Richard is a researcher at the Institute of Environmental Biotechnology at Rhodes University. He's has worked on algae-based systems using sanitation and anaerobic digestion technologies for treating fecal sludge, and currently investigating the link between on-site sanitation and disaster management, on which he'll present now.
Right, thanks. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to acknowledge my co-author, Roman Candish, from the Faculty of Pharmacy, and also the generous support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Research Commission. I don't know if you've been watching the news recently and have noticed that in Malawi there's been some heavy rains, which has led to flooding, and hundreds of lives have been lost. And there's also a threat that's been made aware of, that there's a possibility of an outbreak of disease. So typically, when you have these disasters, you tend to have disruption of sanitation services, or otherwise you have an exacerbation of existing sanitation problem. Now, disasters basically can either be acute or they can be chronic. And acute would be typically where you have an episodic event like a flood, and chronic is where you have the disaster that persists for a long period of time, such as a drought, or in cases in South Africa, where you have a dysfunctional sanitation service, and then communities are exposed to sanitation threats for an extended period of time. Now, the South African government has promulgated legislation, Act number 57, 2002, which is the Disaster Management Act, and basically that provides the guidelines for the establishment of disaster management structures at all tiers of government, which is the national government, provincial government, and the various local forms of government. And also includes and covers occurrences, either natural or man-made, incidents which cause or threaten to cause diseases, and provides the power to respond to these disasters down to local government. Depending on the intensity of the disaster, then provincial and national government will also send aid as well. Now, the Act also requires that a National Disaster Management Information System be instituted. And this system, what it does, it collects data that relates to disasters, the types, the intensity, the frequency, where it occurs, and which communities are at risk to these disasters. And this is one of the ones that interest us. And finally, it also requires the prevention and mitigation strategies to be implemented in the event of disasters. So every municipality is obliged to have a disaster management plan. And this plan is supposed to cover things like anticipating the types of disaster which are likely to occur. It has to identify areas of risk, for example, sanitation would be considered to be a risk. It has to also reduce the vulnerability of disaster-prone areas and communities. It's supposed to promote disaster management research and also have prevention and mitigation strategies at hand. Now, typically with many of these disasters, we have outbreaks of these fecal oral diseases, and these tend to be sanitation linked. And this can be due to unsafe drinking water, poor sanitation, or various hygiene factors. Now, in South Africa, in 2011, according to the National Death Registry, up to 3.8% of all mortalities recorded in that year were due to intestinal infectious diseases, many of which are preventable. And we all know that children bear the greatest burden of these diseases. So in the age cohort of 0 to 14, in 2011, 13.6% of all those mortalities were due to these intestinal infectious diseases. And the most vulnerable age group within that cohort are the 1 to 4. Up to 20% of all mortalities were due to these diseases. And just bearing in mind that they are preventable. Now, in the Eastern Cape province, this is where I live and I work, in this age cohort, the most frequent cause of deaths was these intestinal infectious diseases. About 12% of all mortalities were due to these events. Now, the Eastern Cape province is one of the second poorest provinces in a total of 9 provinces in South Africa. And this province itself is it's almost a story of 2 halves. There's a western half and an eastern half. And this is based on its population distribution. Now, typically in the western part of the Eastern Cape, in the western part of the Eastern Cape, we have this very sparse hinterland. Typically, it's commercial farms, it's game farms, and it's national parks. And in the eastern part, we have these dense, dispersed settlements, where the main activity there is subsistence farming. We also have 2 metropolitan areas, Nelson Mandela Bay Metropole and the Buffalo City Metropole, which serves to attract many migrants from the rural areas. Now, if we plot the type of sanitation that's available throughout this area, typically in the west, we tend to have waterborne sanitation that predominates. But as you move towards the east, we have on-site sanitation as the most common form of sanitation. So, just go back, if you can imagine that the density of pit latrines that we will find in that particular area. And obviously, when you have unplanned settlements, you're also going to have pit latrines being instituted as well. Now, what we're trying to do is to try and rank the vulnerability of various district municipalities according to their sanitation hazards. We're looking at a very crude model at the moment. It's an emergent model, we're still working on it. And we're looking at 3 variables which we're using to populate this particular model. So the first variable we're looking at is the hazard. And the hazard we are using is the frequency of mortalities due to these intestinal infectious diseases. And we look at the age cohort of 0 to 14, which is the children's age cohort, because they're the most vulnerable. Now, if we If we plot the frequency of mortalities with the prevalence of on-site sanitation, what we see is that grouped in the top right-hand corner, where we have the highest mortalities, we tend to have more frequently on-site sanitation. In the area where you have more waterborne sanitation, you tend to have a decreased level of mortalities due to these intestinal infectious diseases. The other variable which we use to populate our model is the expectancy of these particular hazards, and this depends on whether the hazard is an acute one or a chronic one. In the case of an acute hazard, where we're looking at, for example, an episodic event such as a flood, which exacerbates, let's say, a sanitation problem, we can model the expectancy based on the frequency of this event. So in a 20-year flood cycle, we would expect a 0.05 probability of that event happening in that year. In the case of a chronic situation, where the actual disaster is ongoing, we obviously would score it as a 1. And an example would be a dysfunctional municipality, which provides very poor sanitation services. The final variable we have is the resilience. Resilience is the factors that mitigate against the intensity of the disaster or the risk. And this is composed of 2 factors. One is the access to potable water, and the other one is the access to waterborne sanitation. And the data we use to populate this variable is from the 2011 census, which was very meticulous in differentiating different types of sanitation which households throughout South Africa had access to. Now, each of these factors can be moderated with an auditing tool. In South Africa, we have every waterworks is audited on an annual basis, and they're given a score based on a number of factors, based on the quality of the product which they make available to consumers, and also based on the processes, the management and process that are in place. And these are given a score from 0 to 100%. In the case of waterborne sanitation, every single wastewater treatment works is evaluated and audited, and they are scored on the quality of the effluent which they discharge into the environment, as well as the management and process steps that are in place. Now, we know that when we have a lack of waterborne sanitation, we tend to have high incidences of these intestinal infectious diseases, and it also increases the risk of communities to these diseases where there's less waterborne sanitation. So the point of this, so from these factors, we're able to develop our resilience variable. Now, using this particular model, what we've done is we've ranked the various district municipalities according to their risk profile. And we find that the district municipalities with the highest risk tend to be those ones which are located in the eastern part of the province and which has a prevalence of on-site sanitation. And typically, where we have the metros with more access to waterborne sanitation, we have a lower risk profile. But interestingly enough, in one of the district municipalities here, which is the Katalu district municipality, which is the 4th from the bottom, you have a prevalence of waterborne sanitation there, but because you have failing municipalities, they actually score very low. So our conclusions from this particular process is that we can look at sanitation problems that are being acute or chronic. Both on-site sanitation and waterborne sanitation tends to have a risk profile. This model basically highlights the threats posed by on-site sanitation, and what we need to do further is to try and increase the resolution of this particular model by looking at down to the level of a local municipality, and where possible go right down to a ward level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? You you shout my name when you get to them. So that's encouraging poor practice.
Hello there, my name is Sasha Kramer and I work at PD. I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit about the utility of this tool. So once you determine the risk factor, what is the response?
Well, what we want to do really is to, we're really focusing at this stage, it's a version model, we're focusing on a provincial side and looking at trying to provide risk profile to different district municipalities. Where we want to go next is to go down to the local municipalities in each of the districts. Let me just show you. If you look at this map over here, the different colours represent the district municipalities, and each district municipality is broken down into local municipalities. So the idea now is to go down to lower level. So a district municipality is able to evaluate which areas are high risk. Where we want to go to finally is each municipality can look at different wards and also identify areas of risk. So the point really is to make this tool available once it matures at the level of municipalities, so that they can include this into the disaster management plans. They're now able to vet the different areas under their control and focus on areas which tend to have the highest risk profile.
Yes, a second question here. Thomas Stenström, Durban University of Technology. I'm just curious, have you related this to other type of vulnerability factors like land use pattern and put that into a GPS context?
I think as this model matures, we definitely will be exposed to different other variables which we can include as well. It's not exhaustive what we've got here. This is just the starting point. We've simplified as much as possible just to look at the most important variables, but I understand in terms of resilience, there's probably a whole range of other factors we can include as well. And particularly when we go down to where we increase the resolution, I think GPS will definitely come into it.
Perfect.
We'll take one more because I got shouted at, I think.
Just one quick thing, I think it's quite a very direct relation between waterborne and non-waterborne or on-site sanitation that you've been regarding it as to create the risk factors as well. Do you think education will play a big role as well? Because obviously in waterborne areas, you have washing hands, cleaning the toilets and so forth already available. For the VIP toilets, if the same principles apply where you can, and a better education program come forward to train people to wash hands and clean the toilets, surely the risk factors will change drastically, not just because it's on-site.
Yes. Just one of the things I was looking at as well is to include in the resilience is whether there is a hygiene program that's included. And that's what I would put at the bottom as one of the mitigation factors. So to include that with waterborne sanitation and with access to potable water, definitely.
Okay, thank you. We'll have 10 minutes or so at the end for a few more questions. So, round of applause for Richard. So the next presenter is John Allen from Wetlands Work. John's background is environmental engineering, and he's a wash specialist with Wetlands Work, which is a social enterprise in Cambodia, and he'll be presenting on flood resilient sanitation through constructed wetland systems.
Great, thank you, Neil. So, as Neil mentioned, I'm from Wetlands Work in Cambodia. We work with constructed wetlands, creating innovative treatment designs for sanitation in challenging environments. So I'd like to introduce one of the most common emergencies that is both a chronic emergency and an acute emergency under Richard's scheme. So worldwide, flooding is a phenomenon that is increasing, and especially in Asia, this is very common. In Cambodia has experienced very severe flooding in 2 of the past 4 years, in 2011 and 2013. 2 years ago, 2013, more than 700,000 people were affected. But in addition to this sort of acute emergency, we also have a very chronic emergency, which is that there's flooding that occurs annually, and we can see that in Cambodia. So Cambodia has achieved an increase in sanitation coverage in recent years, starting at very low levels in the early 90s, still very low. There's been some improvement. But when we look at flooding, we see that this is where flooding takes place in Cambodia, both on an annual basis, and it's also where the acute emergency takes place. So we see the Tonle Sap Lake in the middle of the country, and then also the Mekong and Tonle Sap rivers, where there's also flooding. That's also where the people live. This is a population density map of Cambodia, and we can see very clearly that the people are living in the flood-prone areas. Not surprisingly, the agricultural. So we need appropriate solutions for these areas. Commonly in Cambodia, we have pit latrines and commonly septic tanks. And this is an example of a toilet here. And you can see a small amount of flooding there. There's a line right here. That's where flooding came up to in 2011. So it's very severe, and these systems are not suited for the type of flooding that we're seeing. And of course, what happens when there's a flood? You have a large amount of fecal matter and septic supernatant that comes to the surface. People are very highly exposed to the water. Kids are swimming around in it. It's a very severe public health hazard. Of course, open defecation contributes to this, but if you have an inappropriate sanitation technology, then the problem persists. So technical solutions are needed. This is the design concept that Wetlands Work has developed in the past year. It's a 3-stage treatment system. It adapts the more common septic system here, and then it uses a planted gravel bed followed by surface wetland. The interesting feature here is that the surface wetland is contained in a plastic liner that floats. And as the flood levels rise, the treatment unit also rises with the flood levels, such that the waste is contained within the pod, which is planted with water hyacinth. Other floating plants can be used as well. And then it works in the dry season. Of course, we need whatever sanitation solution we're using, not only to work in the flood, but all year round. And this is what it looks like when there is no flood. The floating component is optional, but if it is used, then it can be nested within a pond that is elevated. Alternatively, in areas where there is not severe flooding, quite on the level that we saw in the previous picture, then an elevated pond can be used without the floating component. So constructed wetlands are advantageous for many reasons. They harvest, they make a home site for a rich array of microbial activity, protozoans and bacteria at the root surfaces of the plants. We've used water hyacinth in this particular case because the literature is well established that the creation capacity is there in the root surface of the plants. As I mentioned, other plants could be used as well. No chemicals or energy input is required. It works on gravity. It takes place in a small area. A large amount of space is required for this design. So it's practical in urban areas as well as rural settings. And the materials are easily sourced, and there's very minimal operational upkeep, consisting mostly of there's a removable component to prevent clogging of the ground. It's also aesthetically green. It can look very nice, like a pond. So we took a look at the treatment. We tested this over an 80-day period, looking at cholera concentration. An approximate 3 log reduction was achieved. Well, first in the septic tank, there was about a 2 log reduction achieved in E. coli, and then another 3 to 4 log reduction in the septic tank to the gravel bed. And then finally in the pond, we saw an average median effluent concentration of From there, we're developing a product, and we want it to be able to be used by people who like it. We've proved to some degree that it is technically appropriate, but sort of our next step is where we are now. Just in the past few days, the first systems have been begun to be constructed in some homes in Cambodia. And where we go from here is we will integrate principles of human-centered design through interviews and focus group discussions to bring this technology to the point where it meets the needs, the behavioral requirements, and make sure that it's something that people want to have. One of our challenges that we face is that people, on the one hand, getting sanitation to the home in Cambodia is difficult enough, but we're adding these extra components, and of course there will be an extra cost. In a market-based approach, people will have to see the value in these other components in the times of flood. So we have to make sure that we incorporate people's needs and desires into the next stage of design, and really approach that in an iterative fashion. We also hope to optimize the system both for materials and costs and get it to the point where it can be used in a market-based approach. From there, our hope is to deploy it in Cambodia. There's a lot of people in Cambodia who are living in flood-prone areas, but we also recognize that in Asia and beyond, there's a lot of places in need for this kind of technology as well. General recommendations. Governments and development partners recognize that flooding does pose a challenge to sanitation and fecal sludge management. That there is a big gap, and it's going to get bigger because we're talking about a very large population. And then, sort of building off Luke's presentation, there is a strong need for donor and institutional support for the development of products that are suitable for flood-prone environments, such as this. And then finally, when we do have appropriate solutions that are proven, we need to bring them to scale, and we need to do so quickly. And so there's a strong need for support for that as well. I'd like to point out my colleagues and collaborators who are in attendance here: Dr. Tabor Hand, our director, Dr. Rina Chakraborty, and especially Sully Penta. Thank you very much.
Very good on the time as well. We'll take a couple of questions for John specifically, and then we'll get the two people who have already asked questions.
So, firstly, is this being tested in a flood yet? Do you have any? I'd really like to know if you've actually managed to do this with the rising levels and see how it came out. But secondly, based on what you're saying about market, you're going for a market-based approach. So, the 40 households that you're going to be testing it in, are they paying for it themselves, or are you giving it to them as a donation? And then, how will this potentially affect your market? Will you be looking at subsidies, those kind of big questions, or is it too early to say?
Okay, great. Thank you for your question. I will say that we want the technology to be able to be applied in a market-based approach, but not necessarily only that. And then as far as the testing of the technology, so the treatment efficiency testing that we saw here, that was in a controlled setting. It wasn't flooded. Also, this year we did not see the same levels of flooding that we did in the previous year. So in the 40 households, those systems are being built now. The time of year where it will truly be tested will be September and October of next year, because that's when Cambodia sees the flooding. Yes, so those are given under a subsidy program, and there'll be further refinement of the design with the hope of getting to the point where they can be used in a market-based approach. Be tested will be September and October of next year, because that's when Cambodia sees the flooding. Yes, so those are given under a subsidy program, and there'll be further refinement of the design with the hope of getting to the point where it can be used in a market-based approach.
Hi, this is Sasha from Navy again. I'm actually curious if you could show us the design again. I'm a little bit confused about how the effluent from the septic tank gets into the pond when it's raised up.
Okay, great. So yes, it does operate based on gravity, and each system will have to be sited based on the gravity gradient of the area. And of course, the floating component cannot rise too high, otherwise it doesn't work.
So the septic tank effluent needs to be above the level of where the flood is. You need to be above the flood level.
Right.
Okay, very good. We'll have more questions now. So can the other two presenters join John on the stage? And we'll take some questions to everyone. It would be good if we could pick out some of the common themes. I mean, it seems to be this idea of a chronic emergency seems to be the other, like there hasn't been too much discussion on rapid onset or acute emergencies. There's been chronic emergencies. So I think we can bear that in mind for our questions, and also the interesting link between social enterprises and emergency response. I just say that from my perspective, Goals Humanitarian and Development Agency, there is a lot of interest in this area, and it is a big problem in areas like South Sudan where we have sanitation, we have flooding there, in South Sudan, and very impermeable ground because of is a challenge, and it's good that we have a session here to highlight that. Feel free to sit down. So any questions, like general questions would be good to
question for Richard Lobson, still from South Africa as well. Richard, your index, it's nice and simple, which is good because if it's too complicated, you'd never be able to do it. And you're drawing on available databases, that's also good. Just following on John's question, you've effectively zero-rated on-site sanitation. And my concern with that is if an area has got 100% waterborne sanitation and the water supply fails, then you've got a disaster. Whereas if an area is 100% dry sanitation, it doesn't need a public water supply, but obviously the dry sanitation must be done well. So, I hear that you're still developing this thing, but I definitely think you can't zero-rate on-site sanitation if it's done properly.
Yes, the main problem at that stage is because with waterborne sanitation, it's audited. On-site sanitation, particularly if you look at the distribution of settlements in the Eastern Cape, it would be very difficult to audit all of them. I'm not sure what one would do then. I suppose this will merge with a bit of another model. I know it's actually very crude at this particular stage. But if you take, for example, a case in point is some of the municipalities, the local municipalities, as part of Tukadu, you find that despite the fact that you have a lot of access to potable water and waterborne sanitation, it still fails. And this comes out with the blue drop and the green drop reports. So in fact, it's not taken for granted that if you have access to these facilities, that you're not going to have any problems with it. And this is where these green drop and blue drops come into it. The reason why I've actually excluded on-site sanitation and I've just highlighted as a potential source of disaster is because at this stage there's no real universal auditing of these particular facilities. I'm not sure whether it's going to be done in future or whether this actually should be some kind of program that goes around and looks at it. I think one has to, for example, our municipality also has a certain section, certain wards which still have pit latrines on-site sanitation. And they claim that these are regularly serviced. But if I take a walk around those wards and I go and inspect some of those latrines, many of them are overflowing. And they claim that in spite of the fact that they contact the municipality to come and empty them, they're not being emptied. So, you're just relying on information from the municipalities. So this is a problem. I'm not sure what to do with this stage. Maybe more experience with it will formulate some way of auditing them.
Thank you. Is there any more questions? Anyone who hasn't had a question?
Thank you very much, Jonathan Parkinson from Oxfam. We refer to market-based approaches, so I was particularly interested to hear from Yoke if she's looked at the emergency market mapping and analysis tool, and related to that pre-crisis market mapping and analysis, and whether what you're doing would have some relationship to that analysis. Basically, for the audience benefit, it's a way of looking at the market, the suppliers and the demand for products and services in the situation of an emergency, when a humanitarian organisation like Goal or Oxfam could then work with the private sector to help distribute sort of technologies or other products. So I was wondering if that was something that you were looking at. The others might want to comment, but it's mainly true.
The short answer would be no. I think from what we've seen in the news, the procurement for the products that we develop is being done by the big humanitarian agencies who request these products. So I don't really know how that actually fits into then local procurement, because there's a sense that humanitarian agencies for the dreams want to have them supplied by local markets, but they don't trust the quality of the product enough to use it. I've not looked at the EMUA details on the charges.
I see. So your focus is more on the original production rather than the supply and distribution, which I guess the EMA is more focused on. Something we can discuss more.
I might also add that when we talk about market-based approaches, we're talking about demand, and in acute emergency demand pre-disaster, and then during disaster is going to be very different. So it makes it difficult to do that kind of research that you need to do in order to implement a market-based approach, because it's going to change that there's not a flood, people perceive benefit as a certain amount when the flood takes place.
Yeah, there are some very interesting examples of Emma's around WASH. I think more so in water, but particularly East Africa, the water trucking market, and they assess the market during emergency and out of emergency for drought. And they found some very interesting things about the escalation of price of water trucking during drought, and therefore being able to plan to work with the private sector during response as opposed to NGO water trucking directly, which is one of the best examples I think out there. But certainly the scope, I think, in sanitation to link with private business during response, work with social movements. There was a question there.
I am the from Faecal. My question is to John. Thank you very much for interesting presentation and creativity here. And just my short question is whether we have to consider the flood force during the design of this wetland, mainly because the flood force is a tenable structure. Just we have to only consider the height of the flood or other ways.
To consider the what?
Flood force. Generally, the high flood damages the structure of wetland. That's why we have to consider during the designing of this wetland.
Right. So in the designing of this, we want to look at both both the severe flood, the high historical flood, as well as the more common flood. So actually it's one of the previous pictures. So if we in building a system with a small hill like this, basically this we go for more of a more common flood. previous questions, which is that in the event of a very acute emergency where we have very high historical flood that's exceeds anything before, the system can still work temporarily, even if the pod is elevated above the level of the septic tank. It's basically operating as a sort of a temporary, the septic tank is not going to be able to still continuously take in more waste over a long period of time. But over the acute emergency, over a few weeks, then the waste is contained. There's still treatment going on, and it's catered for in that way. Did that answer your question? Okay, I'm not sure I understood it.
Maybe you can have a chat afterwards if there's more questions. I think we have a few more minutes if there's any further questions.
Well, this is also for John, actually. Putting into a new technology naturally needs to assess addition of new risks. In Cambodia, you have a very high incidence of dengue fever, which is mosquito-borne fever. Now, I'm not thinking about the wet situation, but during the dry situation. Since the Aedes mosquitoes are very lazy, they just fly in a radius of 100 meters, then this would be a perfect breeding site for Aedes mosquitoes that transmit dengue. Is this the things that you sort of consider when you are looking into the situation, the siting and so on? I don't say that it is a problem, but it is a thing to consider.
Sure, certainly. We absolutely do not want to be introducing dengue fever. One solution is that it's a pond on a house, and it's many ponds. Fish can be introduced. The fish cannot be too large. Exactly. Otherwise, the root surfaces of the plants and the treatment system won't work. But small fish can be added to the pond, and any mosquito larvae will be eaten by the fish.
That is the normal way of dealing with it, yes, in a simple way.
Yeah, so similarly, we have to incorporate that into the user-centered design aspect to make sure that that fits in with people's expectations as
well. Any more questions? I'm sure we'll have to until we've got a couple of minutes.
Thank you. Richard, I have a question for you. If I understand correctly, with your risk sort of index, I noticed that your hazard is measured in terms of incidence of disease. Is that correct?
That's correct. We are looking at actual mortalities rather than actual prevalence of disease. So the prevalence of disease will be much higher. It's just that we've got records for mortalities and not necessarily prevalence of the IIDs. So our focus on actual mortalities because they are documented.
Okay. My question then, or isn't risk, which is you have in your equation, which is the hazard and expectancy and resilience, isn't the incidence of disease, isn't that a reflection of your overall risk? So it seems to be your equation is a bit sort of, you're using your indicator of hazard, which is in fact reflecting your overall risk.
Yes, look, if we can find data that actually is accurate enough, if we can find records of, let's say, diarrheal diseases, if that is collected and the data is good, we would use that data in preference. But I've cherry-picked this particular data because it is the one that is the closest into sanitation. Obviously, as the model matures, and if there's more accurate information, we would replace it with that. But in the meantime, we're using this.
If you consider the hazard is in fact the prevalence of shit in a community,
yeah,
then measuring the incidence of disease as isn't the direct relation to the the actual extent of the hazard, because you may, there are other factors involved. So I'm not sure I quite,
the other factors which would
a wrong indicator for the hazard.
Well, there are other things which have been excluded at this stage. For example, you might have the actual mortalities might be due to things such as a lack of clinics. So you could actually have, in some areas where you have a prevalence of the disease, mortalities might be much higher in certain areas because of the lack of medical facilities. So I'm aware that there is this perhaps a bias, and that areas which are maybe poorer or poorer served will tend to have these high mortalities. I know that we would have to probably look at other ways of improving the model as well. But at this stage, I think this is the best indication, because it does tell you that there is some kind of dysfunctionism that's present there. If the risk factor is so much more high in certain of these district municipalities compared to others. So it's not, there's no metric as such, it's more a ranking system, and that's what we're using for at this stage.
Thank you. We're going to have one last very quick question from Sasha.
Well, and it's very quick. I think you already began to answer it, Richard, but I'm curious, have you actually looked at the correlation between risk and income level? And have you found that they correlate quite closely?
At this stage, I want to stay away from statistics until I've got a larger database. I can see trends, but I don't want to apply any statistical analysis at this stage. When I've got a larger database, then I definitely I'll start looking at these things. Primarily first at these most obvious indicators. But yes, income would be very important. But if one looks at a particular map and you look at the activities that take place there, particularly in the eastern part, where you have typically subsistence farming, and many people there are also they are migrants. They tend to live there and then they would migrate to a city and work there and come back again, and in many cases come back to die. So that also accentuates the mortality rates. And one of the caveats as well is that at this stage the death registry, in some cases it's not accurately reported what the actual cause of death is. It just says natural causes. So in fact, it could actually be much higher. Sometimes you wouldn't be able to differentiate between it's something that is due to HIV/AIDS or something that could be due to dysentery. One might be compounding the other one. So there's a great deal of complexity at this stage. But at this stage, I want to look at simplifying the model. And maybe when more data are available and we can actually analyze this, then maybe we can find different trends or different causes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We're going to close it there because I think that we're already over time. Cutting into the coffee break. If you have any more questions, I suggest going directly to the presenters afterwards and asking them. Otherwise, please a round of applause for the presenters.